a conference presentation ever. That was strange. I did actually at the Bobcats conference quite some years ago, so it's a great honor and pleasure to be back, especially since the theme of the conference is very close to my heart and my research. So, how library and information science can save the world and why to care. Well, I think we agree this is quite a title, quite a promise I have to live up to. Well, the truth is, I tricked you. Actually, there was a subtitle, but then I thought I would really like to have at least a few people in the audience. So I decided that ever there was a time for being bold, then this was it, and I dropped it. But then, of course, as you would, I had second thoughts, and well, here's the full title. How library and information science can save the world and why to care, or at least why we should let people know what we know about that unruly thing called information, and how this might possibly contribute a little bit to help preventing things from getting even worse. Well, you see these complicated things, you probably would not have bothered even getting up today for that much blurriness and vagueness. And then I didn't even know that there was going to be a party and an all-nighter the night before when I put that. So it is sort of almost the same title, but it's full of maybes and academic blurriness, which is good and which is bad. We, I mean library and information science people, scholars and practitioners alike, are excellent at making things complicated, at problematizing, and I'm the queen of this, at defining and redefining our subject, information, and thinking about our discipline. And obviously, it is complicated, and being able to see and to articulate complexities, ambivalences, and connections, and doing so with respect for others and other disciplines, professions, and knowledge traditions is a very valuable ability. Metacognitive ability, as this is also called, and as we all have, means, okay, okay, maybe something we all have. It means the ability to reflect on differences between disciplines and its expressions in different contains. In fact, we are specifically trained in this. This requires critical working with information libraries and in other similar institutions. Metacognitive ability is not really fundamental for working. It's a subset of areas and most importantly for working in different uses, for working in technology. After all, organizing knowledge, retrieving information, and communicating with people to our users are all subsets which can be described as core skills. And they can only be done with a focus on exactly that. For example, in order to classify information, where you have to be able to use an analysis of different individual documents and research. So the instinctive conditions that make it something really is a prerequisite for all of you and for all of us, for being successful in our field, successful in our research. As the famous definition by anthropologists generalization has, information itself is a difference, but more interestingly, I find information very different. We are so good at making things complicated that we can difference that we exist. That we sometimes forget how obviously relevant library and information science is for so many issues that concern society and the world around and how. Such a virtuous name, obviously relevant to helping us move to outsiders and countries obviously staying a central position with a good standard of arrogance. But following on the politics on aggregations would mean what I just described and continued. It is important to remind us, however, and others, information and rigorous to study and study of the institutions is all core functions. It is societally relevant in a way that is easy to communicate, that we have experience in communication, and that many aspects of society are relevant and not produce something that's community. Not infrequent though, it is motivated by the develop that information, which is insert in the wrong or unnecessary. But it is important to keep in mind that information systems all produce an end, never an end in themselves. As much as we want otherwise, library and information science is more interested in research combined with the social profession disciplinary education, that is discipline and multidisciplinary. This is not surprising considering that we have in most countries, not only ours, as the university select law. It is not unique in any way, however, and even technology also different from the Indian communication studies, gender studies, science and technology studies, educational sciences, or even economics. All these are rallying around hard-to-define concepts, integrated with methods, objectives, theories.
Okay, in times of budget cuts, being interdisciplinary might put you and us in a disadvantaged position, as some have pointed out. Since there is a conservativeness ruling the allocation of funds in academia, it does not usually benefit the hard-to-define, the interdisciplinary ones, and the up-and-comings. On the other hand, disciplines are never fixed. They are born, they grow, they change. They're different things to different people. They are the result of university policies and of research policies, publishing traditions, and even library collections play a role here. While in itself extremely interesting to investigate, from our point of view, we need to be pragmatic. Library and information science exists, it exists as one. Conferences such as this are testimony to, and as educations such as yours are a part of, and this is a very good thing. Library and information science exists at crossroads. Also, this is a very good thing, and it's quite special. The collected experience of being required to relate to other fields, to incorporate other research traditions, to adapt methods, theories, and perspectives, to a degree even to question yourself, is huge, and it's very valuable. The experience of being situated between research professions and policymakers, especially cultural policy and information policy institutions, is invaluable, as is the professionals' experience in liaising between the public, citizens, and the Times users in other functions, and between societal and political requirements. There are downsides as well, I admit, but now I want to focus on the positives and filter the negatives through pretty sunglasses. I'm not doing this just for the purpose of creating a feel-good atmosphere, but rather to set the scene for what I have to say about environmental information for sustainable living later on, and about how much library and information science are needed for this area of research. And here it becomes interesting to ask ourselves, what is information science, what is library and information science, or even more so, what is it we are investigating and how? Or as Michael Buckland formulated it most recently, what kind of science can information science be? There are of course many answers to that and many good ones. I will try my best at giving one with the help of Michael Buckland before moving on to talk about information in practice, more specifically about everyday life information on environmental protection and how to live more sustainably, my own area of research in recent years. If we turn to the secret title that I withheld from you to trick you into coming, I deliberately chose to describe information as an unruly thing. Why is that? Well, firstly, as we all know, there is no agreed view on what information actually is, and many scholars in LIS and other fields have tried to define it, carve out its different borders, find out what it is not, and so forth. Some had the ambition to find one answer, to develop a unified theory of information. Others, often coming from a more constructionist angle, are more careful and have tried to come to terms with how we can find a concept we can all rally around and use, but which is still flexible and adaptable enough to accommodate different interests and needs, to suit a field like ours, multifaceted in research and its professions. I find the second approach more fruitful and situate my own research there. In fact, having a shape-shifting concept that furthermore can fruitfully be investigated from a very wide area of different angles, perspectives, and yes, methods, at the center of our field, makes the field not only exciting, it is also what makes it, I suggest, worthwhile and relevant to continue researching and working with it. Information an unruly thing. Why unruly and why a thing? One such approach, and a particularly interesting and successful one, also a very pragmatic one, is Michael Buckland's, who talks about 3 ways of understanding information. Technology. Information as knowledge, information as a process, information as a thing. What does that mean? Information as knowledge is probably the most common conception and perhaps the one that makes the most problems. What Buckland means here, and I can subscribe to that notion, is that information can be conceptualized as knowing, as a result of being informed, rather than merely knowing of or knowing that. He suggests a constructed notion of information as knowledge, far removed from the ideals of analytical philosophy framing information and knowledge as justified true belief, which puts all the focus on claims to truth of a piece of knowledge. Buckland, in fact, takes issue with both parts of this understanding, with justified and with truth, and lands in what could be called, and this is my addition, a pragmatic material semiotic notion of information as knowing and as constructed, as relational, as culturally specific, and with the distinction between belief and truth entirely blurred or meaningless. Most importantly, we are dealing with questions of trust rather than truth. It is a very imperfect notion in every sense, so to speak, but one that works. Let's move on to the notion of information as process. This is about getting informed, about learning, about making sense. Here, in order to sit well with this just described idea of knowledge as imperfect, as cultural and social, it is of quite some importance to ground our understanding of learning in theories of education, of communication, that account for the social and incremental character of learning. Finally, information as a thing, the third of Buckland's understandings of information. Here he draws mainly on document theory to conceptualize the materiality of information. That is the way in which information is also always in and through something, and this something, be it a book, a poster, a website, a building, or Susanne Brier's famous antelope, co-determines or is part of information. The material conditions afford a certain information, and if we acknowledge the social structuring of our material world, then again the social, the cultural is also in this notion of information, reinscribed back into information itself. This is in focus in the next part of my presentation, but before that I want to give you an example that ties back to sustainability. Information as knowledge. While we have knowledge on scientific research that ties the use of fossil fuels, oil and gas to increased CO2 levels in the atmosphere and hence to climate change, we have no way of knowing if this is true or not. The only thing we can go by is trust in science and trust in institutions that validate science and make policy. We might have some anecdotal evidence on storms, on changes in how much it rains, whatever, but we have to trust institutions that this should be linked to human-induced climate change. Information has as a process then. How did we get to know? Well, we have been informed in some way or another through formal education, through the news, through information campaigns, by environmental organizations, you name it. Mostly in informal ways surrounding us, but also more formally. Materiality then. Well, this shifts, of course, if we take a device-centered approach, one that accounts for how things, devices, are what they are in a context and carry meaning, they are documents, so to speak. Then, for instance, by now airplanes, cars, or even carbon calculators have become a part of climate change in a way that makes them documents that tell us something about it. We will see other examples later on. Well, now we spent quite some time trying to tease apart different notions of information. And now I will try to throw them all together again, not to make a mess, and certainly not to show that we don't need to reflect on these different understandings, but rather to complicate things in a way that draws a thread through these notions, in a way that is productive for what I have to say about everyday life environmental information. Information is not something that simply is, it is something that happens in things, in processes, in cultures. And if we complicate Buckland's beautiful division of labor even further, then we can add it is something that happens in material forms of some sort or another, in doings, in practices, in documents. To put it differently, information happens in practices when people meet documents. Information is furthermore about creating meaning, and through this it is about relations between document, things, peoples, and doings. And this focus is unique for our discipline, focus on information in its material form, in encyclopedias, in databases, in libraries, in museums, in antelopes, and even in compost heaps, as I have argued in my own research, and in its material practices. And this is in contrast to how information is seen in cognitive sciences or even in epistemology, where information is dematerialized and of itself and on its own. A notion which suits the purposes of epistemology and cognitive sciences very well, but which might only be of limited use for information science and for what we actually do in professional practice and what we research. In my own research, recent research in environmental information and sustainable living, I want to draw together theories of practices and theories for understanding individualized forms of civic engagement. Both these are situated within what Bernd Frohman describes as a discourse of practices where knowledge is seen as manufactured and assembled of diverse practices, material, social, cultural, or discursive. He puts this in contrast to epistemological discourse where knowledge is discovered, immaterial, and talked about in terms of truth, meaning, or representation. Also, this notion cuts across Buckland's different understandings without contradicting them. Throughout this talk, I've mentioned the word practice a few times without further ado. But since I already introduced Frohman's discourse of practices, I want to throw a definition at you. In the words of Andreas Reckwitz, a practice is a routinized way in which bodies are moved, objects are handled, subjects are treated, things are described, and the world is understood. I leave it at that for now, but I will return to this notion of practice as something different than behaviors, actions, doings, namely as routinized and culturally specific in a way of connecting activities, things, people, and meaning in a little while. In my work on environmental information, I've tried to highlight the materiality of information, the materiality of informing together with the social character of the material. This is very tangible when looking at how environmental information is made sense of. How does it arrive where it is supposed to arrive? There's a sort of quiet agreement that information is important for how we behave, what we do, what we consume, how we live, but also for how policies are made, how institutions and how companies make decisions. And this agreement also applies to the environment and to environmentally friendly living. Before I continue, I need to make a disclaimer. I'm going to talk a lot about individual practices, although socially constructed, but I want to make a disclaimer that obviously politics matter here. And clearly individual behaviors are not going to solve the climate crisis. But they are a part of the puzzle in some way. This is also very much about institutions and socioeconomic structures that are on a different level, but they also boil down in some way to how we actually do our living in a daily way. Obviously, you would say, if you know what a certain behavior leads to, then you will act accordingly. Well, this is not the case. We know that. Just think about any health issue of your choice, eating junk food, excessive drinking, smoking, contraception, exercising, you name it. The relation between what we know and what we do is very, very far from straightforward. We have received information that was targeted at us, we made sense of it, we learned, and then we more often than not totally dismissed it. Or do we? I leave that open for now, because it is more complicated than that, and I'm not a cynic. Yet still, these are all issues that relate to our own body very concretely, and after a while, not very abstract at all. Information relating to how to lead more environmentally friendly lives is in an even worse position here. It is abstract. The negative consequences are not felt by us yet directly on our bodies. They relate to changes that are then expressed in numbers, in degrees Celsius, in extinct animals, in levels of carbon dioxide, not felt in weight gain, in loss of shape, in a headache, for instance, or they are felt in other people, in remote places, or in the future. I want to illustrate this with some examples from interviews taken from my research on how people make sense of information on how to live more environmentally friendly, more sustainably in their everyday lives. We can see that this task of sense-making is not an easy one when it has to be connected to some abstract threat, a distant future, or an abundance of guidelines. No? Here you have a person expressing his alienation like this. This is technically quite difficult. You should tell about what the European Union should do with its climate deal and that you should reduce 20% of this and that. This is quite removed from concrete demands. Or someone else. What happens often is that when something particularly happened, I mean hurricanes or natural disasters, then it comes to the fore, but in my day-to-day life, it's not like I go around and I'm concerned. And it's also not that I, for instance, refrain from flying just because of environmental reasons or so. But it is, well, what shall I say? And here you have someone else who expresses it like that. I was in Stockholm to visit my brother, and we sat at the shopping mall. And I saw a small leaflet, and they showed different labels, I think logos. And there was an A4 page with 20 to 30 labels, and I just shook my head. That is too much information, and in a way they're fighting against each other, and I think that's a shame. In a way, each organization wants to promote itself, and in a way, this is done at the expense of others. And finally, we have an understanding. He talks for, the person talks as a couple, so I think it's the wife talking also for the husband. We have an understanding of environmental problems, sympathize with the idea, but it's not really present. And a little bit of recycling, we do that even out here in their summer house. We have a compost heap, and I find that natural in a way. Nature's way of taking care of waste, but really I don't have any knowledge of environmental questions. You can see these four people, different people, expressing more or less the same feeling of abstraction, of alienation, of irrelevance to their lives in different ways. All four, also in different ways, also show how they in fact know a lot about the environment, about what they have been told is the so-called correct way of doing things. They exemplify flying, consumption, recycling, they connect to politics and policy making, the European Union, the consequences, natural disasters, to different interests, and that includes commercial ones. They reflect on their own difficulties, their indifference, their coping strategies, you name it. They show knowledge, awareness, and metacognitive ability, and they reflect on the difficulty of, well, practicing information. The divide between abstract information and practice is not due to a lack of knowledge. It is not even due to a lack of awareness of a possible link between individual practices and potential global consequences. The missing link seems to lie with its actualization in everyday life practices. And this in turn implies that the question that what work information campaigns or information can do has to be asked anew. And now let's look at some more quotes from the same interview study. The quotes are partly from the same people, partly from different people. And here, things get a lot more concrete, a lot more anchored in everyday life. And suddenly, the perspective changes and material things and what you do with them concretely comes into focus. We are quite economical with water, really. We don't do anything huge. You do it like that because that's a way of conducting yourself that you have here. And we have a small hot water boiler, so you can't really shower for that long. Another one. Well, it's just easier because it's a residential area, quite defined in a housing body. There are many flats and no distances, so it's easier to organize this. I don't have to go very far for putting my waste into the right bin. Or someone else, it's nothing you reflect on, that you should not, that now we will ride the bike to the beach and leave the car. It's not like that. I don't think like that. But I think now we will go to the beach or to a wood somewhere, and for this we take the bikes. What is interesting here, leaving aside the variety of activities people mention as relevant for the environment, what I want you to focus on is the way in which these are connected, sometimes quite explicitly and reflectively, to routines, to contextual circumstances, to the expected, to the norm, you name it, but to something beyond the conscious doing, even when the practice is then connected to the environment in an after construction, as in this interview situation. Now I use the term practice again. What is that? Let's quickly recap Andreas Reckwit's definitions that we introduced earlier, and which says, a practice is a routinized way in which bodies are moved, objects are handled, subjects are treated, things are described, and the world is understood. So these are ways in which we do things with things, and which are shared between people and which are culturally specific. They have to be quite clearly circumscribed and be repeatable and routinized. Basically, if something is done just once, it cannot be a practice. A practice is social, it is code, it is the way in which something is done. It's the normal way. If something is done differently, it sticks out. For instance, it's the normal way to fly from Sweden to Spain. Anything else you have to explain? I flew. Anybody else who didn't fly? No. Didn't think so. As a researcher, it's normal practice to participate in conferences which involves giving a talk, presenting a poster, participating in a panel or a meeting. Just attending a conference as a researcher without presenting or participating in something or other is considered outside the norm, and people will ask about it. Also, you won't get university funding. So in this case, a paper that you have submitted is not only a paper where you communicate the content of the research, it is also part of a set of practices and the entrance key to the regular door of this conference. For students' conferences, their practices are slightly, the rules are slightly different, but I think you understand the idea. Practices can be recognized as practices because they are stable, at least kind of, and here we have the problem. We can talk about them because they're constant, they are the norm, they are what we don't think about, and information. The unruly thing that happens when people meet documents is about difference, about change. And this puts us in a very difficult place. But only at first sight. Obviously, practices do change. They have always done that. As not least, Elizabeth Shove, who has researched environmentally relevant practices at length, has shown normality and especially normal ways of doing everyday life things with very common objects for quite normal purposes are not stable at all. They are in constant flux. They change. Just think about, for instance, showering, cooking, doing the laundry. All of these are quite significant for the environment. They are seemingly simple practices which have very stable cultural meanings and positions in our lives in a way. But if we look closely, how we do these things today, we can see it is quite different from how our parents did them just 30 years ago, and really not to be compared with how it was done, say, 80 years ago. That would be 1933. Showering daily was just absurd then, and being able to use deep frozen vegetables and Argentinian meat on a daily basis for your casserole, hard to imagine. Not to talk of washing your clothes after having worn them just once, which we do nowadays quite often. We are still doing the laundry, but how often we do it, how effectively we do it, when we think it's necessary to do it, and with this, how much energy it takes and how much detergent we use, has changed dramatically. We are still cooking family meals, but how we do it, what we use for doing it, how long it takes, and not least how much energy it consumes cannot be compared to how it used to be. What all these examples show, as Elizabeth Shove and her colleagues have investigated quite beautifully, is that materials are integral to doing. The microwave, the washing machine, the tumble dryer, the freezer, the power shower, cheap electricity, and so forth. All these things shape the practices we live by and what we consider normal in our culture, and together they change. Materials and practices co-evolve, in the words of Elizabeth Shove. And this is, I think, what we see in how my interviews partners reflect on their lives and its environmental impact. Oh. It is circumstantial. It is context. It is also materials that define whether you take longer or shorter showers, whether you cycle, whether you drive a car or a bike. It is not, in these cases at least, a conscious decision. When it's too conscious, it's not a practice even, at least not yet. But more interestingly, it is not very likely to be sustained. Sustainability requires routine, and routine is what's normal. This illustrates also quite clearly that what is at issue is not simply connecting a private practice to a global issue or the other way around. This is something which seems easily done even with often connected with an overwhelming sense of powerlessness or guilt. The issue might be constructing this initially merely private practice as constructive and as directly meaningful for a person in a certain context, to transform a feeling of guilt and alienation into positive and enacted commitment. And this is, I suggest, where information and its transformative capacity might come in. But we have to understand that information comes also through social practices, and it lands in devices, in things that are meaningful in specific cultures. How can we, scholars, professionals, students, then inform about these issues in a way that also leads to some change in a direction that minimizes damages? Well, I don't have the answer. Just some of the questions, but collectively, as a field of research and as a field of practices, we have something important to contribute. Our other disciplines talk about and research information on the environment and related to practices of everyday life, which is my interest. But information science is largely missing. This is not just a shame for us, because we miss out on funding opportunities and opportunities to make our competence visible. This is first and foremost a shame for the interdisciplinary field of environmental studies. We know a lot about information as knowledge, as a process, as a thing, and so many times we have put the finger on the deeply embedded character of information, on the need to ground it in practices, behaviors, whatever you call it, in what people actually do, and in ways in which these doings are culturally shaped. On it being always in the making and never being just a simple equation, on the unruliness of information. There are clearly different kinds of what can be described as environmental information. The kind I have investigated, and which I also refer to here, is that which ordinary people and policymakers connect to everyday life, to leading more environmentally friendly lives. I deliberately say that which people connect to leading more environmentally friendly lives, rather than that which is explicitly about how to lead such lives, because while targeted campaigns might have this aboutness, it is not always those that arrive in people's practices or even in their awareness. As I've shown, the disconnect between what people know about the environment, or what they say they know and also reflect on, the connection between certain practices and objects and environmental destruction and protection, and what they actually do, is striking. And I'm not saying this to make a moralistic point. My own knowledge is strikingly far removed from my own doings. And I'm saying this to make a claim for the need of information science perspectives in the area of environmental research. The connection between knowing and doing is highly problematic, and information is a link between them. But if we investigate information purely as epistemic content, as facts and figures, as how-tos, as that which fills a gap and impacts behaviors, then the only thing we are likely to find is that it doesn't do anything, that it does not make a difference after all, and that people simply don't care much about much beyond their own direct needs. But this is not looking hard enough. This does not account for the way in which it also has been shown that people learn, that they make sense, they reflect, explain, and make connections. Yet it doesn't always trickle down into behaviors directly. It does, but slowly, and in different, unexpected places. It is a connection which I suggest can fruitfully be visualized as information in the sense as developed earlier, as the meeting between people and documents which potentially makes a difference. Yet this information is notoriously hard to study and notoriously hard to capture. It is an unruly thing, but one which we know a lot about. For instance, we know from research in other empirical fields, from contraception to learning to food and health, that this relationship between being informed and doing is a long, messy process. We know that information activities can be anything and anywhere. They can be very targeted, but very often they are not. They happen rarely in isolation. They are fun and they are necessities. They are just happening to people, or they are initiated by them. They're everywhere. They're about facts and they're about feelings. They're part of work, of school, of being a citizen, a consumer, a family member. They are one big mess. Most importantly, they are intrinsic parts of other activities. They're embedded in larger social practices and shaped by these. In turn, of course, information also shapes practices, and this is what I hope for when attempting to change behaviors with information. And this is what requires a deep understanding of how information might do this. Many scholars from our discipline and from related fields have shown the many subtle ways in which this is the case, what people know, what they have learned, for the various conscious and unconscious information activities is rarely directly connected to what they do. There are connections, but finding those, studying those, shaping those, and simply taking those seriously and not doing away with as hypocrisy or a lack of self-control is not an easy task. But it is what we do, and nobody else does it as well as we. Well, I would like to make a call for research agenda and for practice agenda using an information science torch to look at environmental issues. For instance, how information on how to do environmentally friendly living is shaped, consumed, made sense of how information shapes policy, how our own institutions embed environmental values, how information campaigns are made, how young people develop values connected to information, environmental issues, and so forth. There are many more questions to be asked. The need to develop social and cultural understandings of information, and yes, also of information systems, is huge. How can a discipline that so often motivates itself with social relevance be missing in this interdisciplinary venture that today's environmental research is and also requires? Now I have almost reached the end of my presentation. Just one more thing, which I have promised in my rather bold title. How library and information science can save the world and why to care. Well, actually, I tricked you again. I don't have the answer. But I can say that much. You are in a unique position. You have the skills, the knowledge. You present a relevant discipline that can make a much needed contribution, that has a tradition of social relevance and a tradition of connecting different areas of research, fields of application, different institutions, and the academy and policy making. It would be a shame not to use this position. Thank you very much for listening.